Okay, so Sandra.
I'll bite. Okay, couple things. The first speaker, I think it was amazing what you did on the gender identification and also how we present ourselves when we're talking. I've seen that kind of presentation done before. And sort of, I think for patient partners to go with our CV, maybe CDTRP can help us to do that kind of thing, like to say like, you know, because a lot of times we use she or here, she here. Oh my God, she, her, or he, him, as you know, to showing that. And we're all learning as we go. But I think that identifying like where we, you know, where we're coming from, like our experience and things like that. And, you know, also to like, there was a Canadian patient partner survey done where 70% were white females, right? And that's what I am, right? And they're retired, right? So we do need to get more people at the table, but I really think that that's a really good thing that we could do. CanSolve, amazing work. Selina, you know that, it's amazing. The resources you put together, I'm working through them and that, so I think that was really great. Dawn and Terry, so I've had the pleasure of working with Dawn. I put in the chat. She has really championed patient partners getting compensated. There's been a lot of work done on that and, you know, how we can work on that. And also those decision aids are excellent. They're excellent for researchers, and they're also actually excellent for patient partners that are considering getting involved in clinical trials. And I did share them. I don't know if it was with Patricia or if it was with Mel, but they're there as well again. And they actually asked me, because like I was approached for clinical trials, but the timing was off. And this is one thing I said to Dawn about, like, it was when I was approached, I think it was off. And I did a couple of them, but I was able to speak for Clinical Trials Ontario about what CDTRP is doing. And the other groups that are here is that we're able to be a patient partner. So we're able to set priorities and like indicate where we want the research to go. And so then it was more like, you know, going from being on a clinical trial to then, well, how can then I make sure that whatever comes from that clinical trial is actually implemented? And then, oh, well, how about I go and work with researchers so I can let them know what they should be focusing on. So all amazing work. And this college that Dawn is setting up, I look forward to looking more into that. I have an application in for that, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, thanks.
All right, any other questions? I have some questions too, but I want to make sure everyone gets a chance. I know it's the end of the day, so sometimes people are a little bit tired and maybe more reluctant to say what is on their minds, but please do jump in. Maybe in the meantime, I will ask Sofia a question. Are there any ethical considerations that need to be explored when communicating patient engagement opportunities with PFD partners?
So there's a lot of ways I could interpret that question, I guess. So short answer is yes. And I'll give you some concrete examples from my own experience. So once we submitted to our research ethics board, and we said we are going to ask people their sex assigned at birth, like what it says on your birth certificate, and what their gender identity is. And we actually got pushback from the research ethics board saying that this could be traumatic for people and you could be outing people. And they're right. but part of it is like we needed to, like, the whole point of the study was to recruit people who were not cisgender. So that's sort of a way. This is where, when you have community partnerships, you can, make sure that how the study is designed and how you ask these questions is done in a respectful and safe manner. Because certainly it's not ethical if it's not. And the other thing that came to mind when you said ethical, Jennifer, is, so I told you about how we had such a, I'll use the word great experience. Like, really, I feel really fortunate to be part of this collaboration with Skipping Stone. And we're like, we should tell other people, how it worked for us, so that, people can learn from our experience. So we did. And we sent it into the journal, and the journal came back to us. And it was so obvious, but when they pointed it out, but they said, you're speaking from a very Canadian perspective. And this is not to say that there are not jurisdictions in Canada where it is super safe or super, to be trans. But compared to other parts of the world, like, just, being a participant in your study is, I'll use the word, like a death sentence. And so, like, outing yourself. And so we thought about that a lot. And we actually then reached out to researchers who work in a similar space in 4 different countries to help us put together this guidance document. Again, it's probably outdated now. It's 4 months old, and I'm sure there's new things that could be included. But just, recognize there's the positionality of the researcher and the team, but also, like, where you're doing the research. There's external factors that you have to take, and political factors, for lack of a better way of saying it, that one needs to take into account. So I don't know if that really is your question, Jennifer, when you talked about the ethics, but those are the 2 things that came to mind. So thank you.
Yes, thanks. That's helpful. Okay, it appears we have another question that came up in the chat. So it says, have you noticed that trails that adapted a multiple gender selection process have higher non-cisgender participation rate, or are the rates of cis and non-cis people similar? I think they're wanting to know if it is working.
So I know that there is I'll use the word, a movement to being more inclusive in collection of that type of data. And there is also resistance, because change is hard, as we all know. And even if it's change that you want, and there's some people who, have worked out really well doing things a certain way. And so all this to say is, I can't answer that question right now, if there is better incorporation of non-cisgender participants. I can say that in our study, like I said, we've never had such fast recruitment for our study. And I think that reflects the community partnership. So I do like to think that because there is more of a movement, because of fantastic forums like this, community and people with lived experience partnerships, I do think in 10 years we might have hopefully sooner, a much different conversation about that. But I couldn't tell you that right now.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you. Okay, so I have another question. This one is for Selina. It's along the same kind of lines, like, how can CanSolve evaluate the effectiveness and impact of the developed research tools from both researcher and PFD partner perspectives?
That's a great question, Jennifer. And one of the things I didn't mention in my presentation was during the course of the development of the learning branches, we did get an evaluation expert join our committee to sort of guide us on what are some of the key considerations when thinking about how we're going to evaluate these modules. Like, what does success look like? And it was very interesting because from the patient perspective, we got a very different notion of what success would look like, right? I mean, yes, as researchers, like, we're thinking about metrics and numbers, right? Like usage. Patient partners were thinking, we're actually forcing us to kind of go below the surface, right? Like, how is that changing the culture? Like, is this actually, are we really walking the talk, right? And I think I think what we did, so from a practical perspective, all the learning branches created logic models. So we sat down with all our patient partners and these working groups, and we talked about what are the things we want to measure, what's going to be important for us, right? And then how are we going to track it? So, I mean, we're lucky we have a very robust operations team, and we have a good core committee that can support us in these areas. But a lot of that guidance actually came from us learning together as a group when we invited our evaluation expert, and then sitting down and really taking note of what was important to everybody. So we're collecting feedback, so both qualitative and quantitative feedback. A lot of our modules, when you complete them, it gives you an option to, provide some feedback. What did you like? How would you use this? What could we do better? So it is a very iterative process. And, we do hear back from people who do use these modules. And I think when you look at, for example, you look at the storytelling module, like our graduates have just like the confidence in the way they tell their stories is so noticeable, and people have commented on that. And that's why other groups have been asking us, how can you make this available? So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Okay, so if I don't see any other questions right now, I do have something to ask Dawn and Terry. You talked a little bit about some of the challenges you've experienced when integrating PFD partners. I'm wondering if there's some information you can share on how you addressed those challenges.
Terry, are you comfortable sharing any of your experiences, or would you like me to go for it?
You go first, Dawn.
Okay, no problem.
I'll chime in as needed.
Okay, no problem. I think some of the things that we've learned about working with patient and family partners is like, for me, this is my job, right? So I'm typically working Monday to Friday, 9 to 5-ish. And for them, it's their life, right? And I also wear a patient hat, so I get that. So I think flexibility can be a big barrier for some people if we're only offering the opportunities to participate that happen during like a traditional work week per se. And we're not offering options outside of meetings or like I will usually offer for our engagements, if people can't make it, but they really want to engage, they can either just send me their thoughts, or I'm happy to meet with them, quite honestly. So for me, it's kind of about tailoring how people can provide input that want to, and that's like that should be my job, right? That if people want to contribute, I find ways for that to happen. Terry talked a little bit about compensation, and Sandra indicated like that's something I've been really big about, is that if people do want to be paid for this work, that we find ways to do that. And we find ways, again, that work for them. So sometimes organizations are constrained by what they can offer, or sometimes people can't accept payment. So again, can we be creative or flexible around that? Another thing that I think is a challenge is we don't do a great job at seeking out different perspectives. So I think that Dr. Ahmed showed a really nice way of working with a group, right? And she kind of talked about, and then I got introduced to this person, and then I got introduced to this person, and it led me to this person. And so it can be a lot of work for the people who are trying to engage, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing that. Again, that's our issue. And if people don't know that there are ways that they contribute to the kind of work that we do, then again, the fault lies with us, so to speak. So for me, those are some of, I don't know if they're difficulties, barriers, challenges, whatever word you'd like to use. And Terry, is there anything you'd like to add? Again, feel free to just add what you're comfortable sharing.
Sure. Well, most of my experience has been within the cancer research realm, but I find that it can be really difficult to recruit patient partners and recruit. I know recruit's not a good word. Encouraging them to participate in clinical research as a patient partner. I think that's one of the biggest challenges is how do you find these people and how do you reach out to them? So patient organizations or cancer patient organizations are usually a good source, but when you try to establish contact, there's very little awareness as to, well, what does a patient partner do? They don't understand the commitment very, very clearly, and so they're uncertain. And the things that Dawn mentioned as well really factor into it. At the Ontario Institute of Cancer Research, what we've done is of course, there's a lot of preclinical and clinical research taking place that's sponsored by OICR. And we're really focused on incorporating patient partners within the research. We've painstakingly reached out to probably dozens of different patient communities, cancer patient communities, to find people who are interested, and then have brought them into a pool at OICR and have train them in some of the basics of what being a patient partner is, and some of the basics of how clinical research and preclinical research works and how they can fit in and that sort of thing. And we've also, by building this large pool, also created a pretty diverse demographic as well. And we went out of our way to establish that. And that's challenging in itself. So that seems to be helpful in terms of, breaking the awareness barrier and bringing people in as a group, training, and being able to tap into the group and match people with research that they're interested in, and
That's
go
great.
from there. So that's
Thanks.
yeah.
All right, thanks, Terry. I just want to give a chance for Mary to say something. I noticed her hand was up.
Thanks, Jennifer. I just wanted to expand a bit on what Selina talked about in terms of having project managers. We've also at CanSolve taken advantage, I shouldn't say taking advantage, but we've utilized the skills that some of our patient partners have and have brought them in as in a contract basis to be able to be those project managers as well. So it's bringing that patient partnership to a different level as well. And it's really, we've connected people with their passions. Like one of our patient partners who was on the training mentorship committee was also a teacher, and she brought the storytelling module to life in terms of bringing it all together and finalizing it. So it's just been really good to be able to acknowledge the skills that people bring in to their patient partner life, and that they're more than just the patients, that they are that have the ailments that they deal with, regardless of what it is. So I think it's just really, really good to acknowledge that we've been able to do that as well, and it's been really successful.
That's great. Thanks, Mary. Any other questions? No. How much more time do we have? I just want to make sure we have a little more time, because I do have some other questions, but I don't want to overstep. Leonard, are you trying to cut me off here, or do we have more time?
I'm just getting ready. Whenever you're ready, I'm ready.
Okay.
We have more time, Jennifer.
We do. Okay.
If the speakers are willing to continue, we can go on with some more questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So another question for Sophia, if you don't mind. What advice would you provide researchers unsure of how to effectively translate and communicate complex scientific concepts without compromising accuracy?
That is such a good question, Jennifer. So the first thing I would say is practice. I mean, we don't get better at anything unless we try. And we going to make mistakes? Absolutely. Have I made mistakes? Absolutely. And I think it's really important that we do this, though, that when we have a study, like the end goal shouldn't be publishing the paper, which is important so that, you know, people who do this type of work see it, and equally and probably more importantly, that it gets out there to the general public, partly for people who live with whatever condition, know about it and can talk to their healthcare provider, but also, like, really, I told you at the beginning that my research is funded by CIHR, which is a federal funding agency, and we are all taxpayers. And it's important that we see that the importance of research, and because, you know, we pay for this collectively, and we want to make sure that, we are getting value for our money, but we need to make sure that people recognize that they're getting value for their money, and that this is a way that research can really improve their health and well-being and that of their families. So that would be practice. It gets better with time, and will we make mistakes? Absolutely, but that's part of life. So
right. So we have to be willing to do the messy work because it's worth the effort.
Exactly.
Okay. If we have time for one more, I have a question for Selina. It's about the idea of potential biases that PFD partners might need to identify. What strategies can be used, or what training can be provided to help PFD partners identify and address any potential biases as they help develop tools for the broader research community?
Well, that's a great question. Before I answer that question, I'm just going to add to what Sophia said earlier with regards to your first question. So from a practical perspective, you know, distilling complex information and making that accessible is a skill, and I agree, practice is a must. The other, I would definitely suggest looking at the KT module, because there is a section in that module where you learn to distill complex information, right? Like, how do you go from like scientific concepts? How do you find the right information? And then how do you communicate that using plain language? So there's some really good tools and resources. So from a practical perspective, I think that's a great one great tool. The other thing too is another way to help with a better understanding of complex concepts is really to utilize storytelling techniques, right? And I mean, it's a great way to, you know, when people start talking about the research that they're passionate about in a way that is understandable, whether you use metaphors, or you start off with your positionality statement, telling us what you're passionate about, right? There are lots of techniques and ways to do this. So I thought that was a really good question. In terms of how do we address this idea of potential biases that our patient partners bring to the table? So, I mean, it's I'm not sure I can answer that very confidently, because it is one of the things I think we've embraced our patient partners coming in with their experiential knowledge and where they're coming from their own stories and their own places. And I think we have to acknowledge that those biases are part of their experience. It's part of who they are, right? So I think having that acknowledgement, and our researchers do this really well. They start off by saying, this is where I'm coming from. These are sort of like even disclosures. But I think sometimes the biases are not necessarily something to work from a place of, you know, as a negative. It's a recognition of that, because it really can help us understand why this is of importance to them, or why they're so vested in whatever position that they have, or why they're part of this. I wonder if Ruth or Dawn, if you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, Ruth, do you mind, sorry, Dawn, did you want to jump in there for a second and then maybe Ruth?
No, I was going to say Ruth had her hand up first, so I'm happy to follow, but yeah, I've got some thoughts here
Please go
too.
ahead. I'm happy to wait.
Well, I think Selina did just a really nice job. I think we often tend to think of biases as bad things, right? But I think that when we're engaging with people who have lived experiences, to be quite honest, it's their biases and it's their experiences related to those that I'm most interested in. And let's not forget that researchers also have biases, right? I mean, they're researching a specific area because they're super interested in it. So I do think it's kind of funny the words we use and maybe some of the intonations related to them that we think are like, you know, and same with disclosures, like disclosures somehow are a bad thing, right? But like they're not, they're just you being transparent about where you are and where your position is. So I really like how you stated that, Selina, in terms of it's not always a bad thing. So go for it, Ruth.
Thank you so much. I think truly the discussion here is wonderful and very, very much to the point with some of the challenges one faces. I'll share a thought with regards to, so to speak, biases and personal experience and how it affects decision-making to a certain extent. Just experience with regards to a recent public deliberation that we pursued. In that context, we sought the public's input with regards to modification of organ allocation. So the context is, I would say, challenging. There's limited access to transplantation. If there's modification in organ allocation, there's always a concern that equity might be influenced. And in that context, there was a sense that people with lived experience with risk for end organ disease should be certainly consulted as experts given their lived experience and share their stories to provide context to members of the public who would be otherwise impartial and in that capacity facilitate informed decision-making, but would not influence decision-making to a certain extent. So I think it's very interesting how best to incorporate this lived expertise. Just to presenters, I think you've done a wonderful job distilling complex ideas and sharing all of those experiences. And so thank you so very much. The point that I wanted to make was with regards to communication. It's key. Without effective communication, really we cannot facilitate knowledge translating into action. If I were to quote Selina's, some of Selina's KT teachings, I was wondering about the enrollment again of patient partners in this domain, because there's development of expertise in the context of the research project, if there's true engagement from beginning throughout the process, and that kind of a communication is effective towards general audiences. So your thoughts with this regard. The second point is, I just wonder, have you experienced that ongoing engagement makes the patient partners also utilize this kind of professional jargon that we might be tempted to use at times? So I'd love to hear from your experience on this.
Sorry, who was the question?
To whom? To the group, but maybe Sofia, would you like to start first, and maybe for the other panel members to join in? Dawn, Selina, Terry, would love your thoughts.
Sure, I can start. So I hadn't actually thought about that, Ruth, and it's so nice to see you. I would say no. I would say it was more the other way around, that the research, well, I say the research team when we're all the research team, but maybe the non-community organization partners which include me, really, like my vocabulary has really expanded, and I use some of the terminology, like, for example, something called gender gear. Gender gear is where you wear not really clothing, but more gear that gives you the appearance of sexual secondary characteristics that are more in alignment with your gender identity. And so that's something, for example, when we were doing our protocol, because we do need our participants to, I don't want to say undress, but, you know, when we take blood pressures or we do arterial stiffness, and so things that are in, you know, areas that are a little more sensitive to have people touch, we kind of recognize, oh, like these are things that we need to take into account. And this is when I talked about cultural safety, like having the right language. So all this to say is I think it would go the other way, at least in my particular case.
Thank you.
Did that answer everything you wanted, Ruth? Everything.
I'm sure it's it's a complex topic, but I think Sophia has done a wonderful job responding to it. So looking forward to more questions if people would like to pose them.
Okay, do we have other questions? If not, I will pose another one of mine. I feel very selfish here. Okay. So this is for Dawn and for Terry. How has the involvement of PFD partners in research prioritization impacted the outcomes of clinical trials at the college? Do you have anything you could comment on related to the outcomes being different now?
Maybe, Terry, I'll ask you to go first. There's some things that we've worked on together, but I'll ask you to share some of your experiences first.
Yeah, so maybe my quote unquote clinical research experience. Yeah, I think as I mentioned in my part of the presentation, it's pretty important that patient engagement through patient partnership takes place as early as possible in the research cycle to allow patient partners to provide input into the research question and help shape it so that and the protocol development as well, so that the clinical trial or clinical research taking place is not so narrowly focused just on clinical results that will appease the researcher, but will also focus on incorporating things that are really important to the patients that are downstream of the research. And that's, of course, based on one's lived experience as a patient partner being able to provide this sort of input. And so, yes, indeed, it can be done, and it is done. We bring up issues that are important, such as quality of life issues. It's not necessarily about always about maybe living that other 6 months, but being subject to pure hell versus, a quality of life with another therapeutic approach or a way of rolling out that therapy. So, yeah, patient experiences and patient outcomes definitely can be brought into the research cycle early as possible with us participating in developing research questions and the design of the clinical trial. So yeah, very, very important thing.
Thanks, Terry. That's great.
Jennifer, maybe I could just add for a couple of minutes if there's time.
Mm-hmm.
So I can give an example that Terry has been integral to and other members of the college. So CTO doesn't do clinical trials ourselves, but back when the pandemic started, clinical trials shifted from participants having to go to a site to finding ways for them to continue to participate safely, whether that meant the trial coming to them in different ways or things just being done differently. And so these were discussions we were having as an organization about how can we support this massive, really quick pivot to how clinical trials were being done because of the pandemic and because of the safety concerns related to COVID. And so we were having discussions amongst people who do clinical trials with the College of Lived Experience. And there were a few college members there talking about their potential preferences given the situation. And actually through that conversation, we decided to do a project related to surveying people around their preferences and attitudes towards participation in clinical trials in non-traditional ways. So either what we call decentralized trials, where they don't go to like a hospital site, they might go to another site closer to home. That would be a hybrid trial, or just everything comes to them at their home. And so we've actually just completed that survey, and we're working with the college. They worked with us to develop all the questions to the survey. They tested the survey before it went out. They helped us to promote the survey, and now they're working with us to interpret the results of the survey. So, you know, that really was an idea that came from our discussions with our college members. We wouldn't have done that survey otherwise. And I think especially with where we are in the pandemic, where a lot of things are just going back to quote normal, right? Like we're just pivoting to how things were before, because I think I heard one of the other panelist members say like change is hard, right? So we know how to do this already the way it used to be done. And we're trying to say, but you know what, participants maybe don't want that so much, or maybe in some cases there are other ways for you to consider how trials might be done that are maybe more convenient to them to be able to participate, and for them to fit being a participant into their already busy lives. So I just wanted to give that as an example. That was a really nice example over the past 3 years, where if we wouldn't have been working with patient and public partners, we wouldn't have done that survey. And there's going to be a bunch of subsequent things that come out of that. So yeah, there's just an example for you.
That survey was a really good idea, because we can't just make assumptions. So now we actually have some concrete data of what people prefer, which is great. Thank you.
That's exactly it, Jennifer. The people who work in our space are driven by evidence, right? And so we thought if we can gather the evidence related to that, we'll have a really good argument for why things might be better off done differently.
Mm-hmm.